Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Neurodiversity from the Inside Out, the future of our children. My name is Uzma, and I'm thrilled to be your host for this important conversation. Today, we'll be looking at the hidden struggle when neurodiversity is invisible, and we welcome Khawla Barley. Khawla Barley is an experienced inclusion advocate and the parent of an autistic teenager. She is the founder of Goals UAE, a community-based initiative providing inclusive sports programs for people of determination. Khawla brings over a decade of practical leadership in advancing autism inclusion across sectors. Her advocacy is rooted in lived experience, from navigating diagnostic pathways and therapy services to facing systemic barriers in education and community access. Khawla has worked to ensure her son receives the support needed to thrive. These personal challenges have fueled her commitment to building more inclusive systems for all families. In her previous role with Special Olympics UAE, Khawla led national initiatives such as Unified Robotics, the world's largest inclusive STEM program, and Learn to Cycle, which promotes independence and mobility for children of determination. She has also developed community training programs for educators, coaches, and healthcare providers to strengthen inclusive practice across the UAE. Well, Khawla, what a beautiful introduction there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so impressed and I'm so excited to have you here. And to be honest with you, Khawla, I just want to dive right into our first question, if that's okay.
Of course.
Thank you. I really want to ask you, Khawla, you have a wealth of experience, and I want to ask you, what does invisible neurodiversity, and I ask this from a personal point of view actually as well, because I know you personally, and a
Yeah.
professional lens here, what does invisible neurodiversity mean to you in the context of, children in education?
Yeah. I think that um, many of our kids have huge amounts of capacity, right? They have incredible talents. They have ideas. They're able to, um, function, if you will, in school. They can get good grades. They can follow directions.
Yeah,
They can sit in many cases. So their support needs become invisible to many people.
yeah,
And I think that's really, really what happens to, in my own case, my son, and many other, children that I've known throughout the years that have lots of, I think that it's really hard for even educators, even, inclusion heads, and people who have experience working in inclusion. It's very hard for them to reconcile in their mind the individual in front of them who can talk about, psychology and talk about things happening in the brain, or talk about, how a car is working or a scientific principle, and yet they're not able to ask for help.
yeah,
They're not able to share the struggles that they're experiencing, their mental health things, and just simply, saying I didn't understand something. It's very hard for people to reconcile this, and I think that's where the invisibility
yeah,
uh, is.
yeah. I think that's a really important point you made there, because I feel, and I might be wrong here, but from my personal experience, because I'm coming from, I guess, a parent's, point of view here as well, they, because in my case, my son, he's really passionate about tech, right? So he
Yes.
will talk about it to a very high level, and then when it comes to asking for help or support, it's often not given, because the idea here now is, well, he's fine, he's okay.
Yeah.
So I feel like they kind of, it is invisible, and they work extra hard. They have to work extra hard to fit in and to mask day in and day out, and that's exhausting.
Yes. Absolutely. I think one of the things that I have heard a lot, and is, well, he's doing well, he's good, and he's good enough,
Yeah.
what do you want? And in this case, my son, who's on the autism spectrum, he is my youngest, so I was an experienced mother to some extent when I had him. And I really think it must be very different if your first child
Mm.
has a neurodivergence, because you're not as confident. But I'm kind of like, no, I've done this before, and you see a clear difference. But being told that he's good enough because he can speak and
Mm.
he can manage academically, or in some cases maybe even excel academically, um, I find so gut wrenching, because who is it for someone else to decide that anyone is good enough?
Yeah.
And especially in education, and as you know, here in the UAE, we pay a premium for education here in the UAE, and you want your child to be able to get everything they can from that, and to be able to essentially explore as far as they want to go. And so when you have to come to terms with the fact that everyone around them is kind of just accepting, okay, you did a math problem, that's good enough, you got a passing grade, that's good enough, instead of really looking at our kids and thinking, how far could they go? Where is their interest? How can I help them maximize their potential? I really have never felt, never once with my son, that anyone in the field of education was looking at him and thinking, let's maximize this kid's potential. I've never felt that with him. And
Wow.
I think that's incredibly painful, if you really take a minute to think about it. But I've never felt that anyone has looked at him in that way.
Wow.
Uh, yeah,
That's huge.
and
That's
and I just imagine what it must feel like, because I think that a lot of our kids do internalize these messages that they receive, but they aren't able to really express them, um, how they impact them. And I know in the case of my son, he really struggles to express feelings that are unpleasant. He's unable to really express like emotional crisis until it really, is in a crisis state.
yeah.
Um, and and so it's really, I
Mm.
worry about what it does to him, to internalize these messages, because if I see them, I only engage with the school infrequently, right? He's there every day, getting feedback from teachers, watching how they engage with him, and I can only imagine what it must feel like. Because I
Yeah.
know during parent-teacher conferences, it's very clear that the majority of the teachers, again, are not looking to at my son in terms of what could he achieve, but just kind of saying, yes, he's getting by. He's meeting the, kind of that line. He's adequate. He's
Yeah.
doing this, he's doing that, tick, tick, tick. Um, and it's really, it's, to be honest, I haven't gone to the last few parent teacher conferences, because I myself was uncomfortable, and I saw that my son was very uncomfortable, um, with the conversations, and the way teachers were describing him. They weren't engaging with him. The three-way
Yeah.
parent teacher with the child. And I've been to many of those with I have 3 kids, many of my kids, and usually starts with the teacher asking the student, so how do you feel about, history, or how do you feel about chemistry? And, can you tell your mom like what we're doing? And with my son, the last parent teacher conference that we went to, I think we managed to see about 7 teachers. Only one did that. And my son was engaged, and my son was, responding to him, and my son was smiling, and he was relaxed. And in every other engagement with the teacher, they didn't even address my son. They began to tell me about his learning support, or about, he's doing fine, and just, but no engagement with him. No real discussion about him as a student. How was he engaging with the material? How was he engaging with his peers? What maybe we could do at home to either support a challenge, or, encourage him in a way. The teachers all were really trying to, the message to me was to reassure me that he was meeting the standard, kind of thing. It was like, no, he's okay. He's okay. I heard this a lot. He's okay. And I just, it's almost as though my son was invisible to
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
that he wasn't seen as a student. Even though he's enrolled in the classroom like everyone else, we pay the fees like everybody
Mhm.
else, but he as a person was really almost invisible to the majority of the teachers.
Wow.
And that's really hard as a parent, again, to really come to terms with. Um, and I can only imagine what it is like to sit in those classrooms every day, and have that type of engagement with teachers. I think it must be tough.
I think you've touched on such an important, topic here with the way the current situation is at schools, because I understand, there's, large class size, and, we have to, educators are dealing with a lot. I respect that, and it's a hard job.
Yep.
But to understand that that child who may think differently doesn't lack certain skills, and give him or her the chance that everybody else has, is so important. Because this is why, I mean, this topic for me is really important, and to have to share this with you, especially because I feel, my child is in a very similar position.
Yep.
I mean, we opted to home educate, because I felt that that was, for me at the time, was so important, because he was just a number in the class, and
Yep.
because he was on the autism spectrum, there was always something which is a challenge, right? And I felt, his academic needs were not being met, and because his academic needs were not being met, there was other challenges that followed, like behavior, social, emotional development is being impacted. If we can understand, when I say we, I say as educators, for example, if educators or the school can understand that this child is neurodivergent, does think differently, and that's okay, but provide all the opportunities everybody else is getting, you know,
Mhm.
there'll be a huge difference. Because the kids are here, this is why I'm, really this conversation is important to have with you today, because it's our children, or those children that fall into the crack. That's the only word I can think about, that crack. Because I feel, and I say this all the time, I say they're neither here nor there. Does that make sense?
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no, I definitely, and this week I had the opportunity to be part of a conversation that's looking at refreshing a strategy here in Abu Dhabi for people of determination. And one of the things that, kind of became glaringly obvious through this conversation was that we keep catering to the middle.
Yes.
right? So, and I understand in practical, especially when you're talking about government and policy and allocating resources and things, it's quite difficult to create those priorities. But I think, we just cater to that midsection of any kind of disability classification, right? We don't want to really look at the cases that are so hard, right?
Yeah.
Because we may not see progress and we don't quite know what to do. But then on the other hand, we want to really, I feel like it's almost like you want to relieve yourself of the burden. As you said, teachers are overworked, right? And they're overworked. They have lots to think about. They've got multiple kids with all kinds of different abilities in their class. Even those that are not neurodivergent or don't have learning disabilities, everybody has their differences, right? Um, and they have a tough job.
Yeah.
And so I think it's almost, I mean, I don't know, is it a survival mechanism for a teacher just to believe that any difficulty my child is having is just, his own doing, his own choice? He's capable of asking for help. So if he doesn't ask for help, then he doesn't need help or he doesn't deserve help. It's so incredibly hard for them to understand that he struggles with that, or it's so challenging for teachers to understand that my son is not lazy or or trying to not comply, but he truly, to remember to go on to teams and to go on to teams and to wade through the different systems and to organize what do I have to do at night, sometimes just doesn't happen, and he can't, it's very challenging for him to express to me
Yeah.
he needs help with that. Um, so then assignments don't get turned in,
Yeah.
and I think it's easier for the school to just sit back and say, well, he's capable and the parent's capable, so this is not on us. We've
Yeah.
given, yeah, it's not on us. Um, but even outside of school, in my son's case, he loves music and he's actually has an incredible innate talent. He can compose music by ear and things like this. Um, but his engagement with music has been a roller coaster, and it's 100% contingent upon who he's working with.
Wow.
Um, and it's really sad to me because he will spend, in time periods where he has someone who can engage with him well, he spends, I can hear him all night composing and he gets excited and he wants to, share things. And then he'll get a teacher that they're not bad. And he'll even say to me, no, there's nothing wrong with them. But I can see kind of the decline in interest. And when I listen to how the teacher kind of, how this instructor will talk about him to me or in front of him, they'll say things like, well, he's just not this, or he's just not that. And I've tried to say multiple times, if there's something you want him to do, can you send like a message? Maybe a
Mm.
message to me, maybe a message to him, something, and they'll always say to me, but he knows. He knows. It's like, okay, he
Yeah.
knows. I understand that you've told him, but just even asking for a simple support like that. And it was incredibly eye-opening to me over the summer. We spent the summer in Canada. And one of the things, and we were there for about 2 months. And, I was very aware that I didn't want, my son to kind of be idle and he'd be in a new environment. So I kind of wanted to give him something to, focus on out of the gate and have some continuity over the summer. So I was lucky enough to find a music school that actually caters to neurodiverse students. And the difference in his engagement and, the way he walked out of those sessions was incredible. I mean, he literally was glowing. You could just see the excitement like from inside of him. And again, it was just the fact that these instructors, they weren't particularly specialists. Do you know what I mean? We weren't talking about people who had special education backgrounds or anything like that, but they were individuals who, knew enough and had taken, the time and worked with this population of students, right? Of neurodiverse kids, and had gained skills and asked questions, and just were able to create these environments where they weren't expecting them to remember everything, right? So just simple things like after every session, there'd be an email that would come to both he and I that just recapped everything that he did. It probably
Wow.
took 5 or 7 minutes, right,
Yeah.
for that instructor to do. And they did it as a matter of course. You didn't have to ask. And they were thorough, and it talked about all the things that he did well, and it talked about the things that, he had wanted to work on. So it just was so obvious that things were just very subtly being framed to work for him, right? And
Yeah.
it made a huge difference. But this just isn't how kind of mainstream uh, education works,
Yeah.
um, and it's hard. It's very. I think
Yeah.
it's a very very um, takes a big toll on our kids, a big big emotional toll. And I think that this is a conversation you and I have had about just the emotional toll, that you start to see, I think, showing up in those teenage years, um,
Yes.
which is probably an accumulation, right? A combination of an accumulation of these stresses, and then also the increased awareness, um, of the kids. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not a psychologist, so I couldn't pretend to give you a real scientific reasoning for it, but it's definitely something that I think I hear from other parents as well of kids, around the same age, and I think it's
Yeah.
definitely something that we all need to talk about more.
Absolutely. And I think what you've mentioned here, Khawla, the kind of comparison, and I think this is a really beautiful example actually, because mainstream, okay, for example, neurodivergent in children, or let's say, they can articulate, they have a passion, they have an interest, they're doing well day to day at school. But I think the struggles, and again, from my personal experience, will be the executive functioning here, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Retaining information, managing the day, remembering the tasks, for example. What happens in this case is we will say, well, he's doing all right. So I'm sure he can manage packing his backpack and getting ready for school. He's doing okay. He can, present an assignment in his topic of interest, for example, at a very high level. So we don't need to remind him, or we don't need to go the extra mile. Even if it's using visuals in the classroom, or having reminders, or having a timetable that's very clear about transitions. Well, they don't need it. They're
Yep.
doing okay. That's when I feel there's a struggle. And then you've just compared now to his experience over the summer.
Mhm.
It was different, but I don't see a lot of input there. I just saw something very simple and standard, where he was, you were sent an email, he was sent an email. Um, but look at the difference.
Yeah.
He came out, happy,
Yeah.
glowing. So it's a small, and I always say this even when I'm training, when I'm conducting training for like corporates, I'll say, look, we don't need to change the environment massively. It could
Yeah.
be something very simple, a simple adaptation, accommodation, sometimes costs nothing. It might just take a little extra few minutes in your day, but that makes a huge difference to that neurodivergent individual. So if we
Uh-huh.
can do that in a classroom setting.
Yeah. And I mean, in goals, we work through, so the program Goals UAE that I started about 10 years ago. I mean, we work with mainstream sports academies. So I very specifically, did not want to create yet another organization that, brought together people just to support people of determination in, kind of isolated ways. Really what we want to do is we want to create change in the community.
Yeah.
And honestly, there are a lot of people across many different sectors that have an interest
Mm.
in supporting people of determination. So that's been our focus. And I think, as you said, with educators, there's small shifts. And I think what we see is coaches who come to us with a desire but no formal training, right? Outside of being a coach, right? And sometimes, they don't really have the confidence. They don't want to do the wrong thing or the right thing. But a lot of times it's very small shifts. And I think sometimes it's just really focusing on observing first,
Yeah.
right? Not going into that session with, you have a plan. I'm not saying go in and you're completely winging it in the classroom or in a coaching environment, but going in there with a plan, but also just that mentality that you're there to observe at every
Mm.
step of this process, right? And when you see that something needs to shift a little bit, you need to take a step back, or you need to add, like, a visual support, or you need to write something down, then they do that, and those simple shifts create incredible impact.
They do.
Um, yeah, exactly. And that's, akin to what my son experienced over the summer. You get, again, not special education or autism or neurodivergent specialists, if you will, but people who had taken the time and the interest to work in this space and to learn a little bit,
Yeah.
and work in an environment where some systems were put in place, some simple systems were put into place to support, kind of the neurodivergent mind.
Absolutely.
And the payoff is incredible. Um, and I just think, these kinds of little pockets of great practice really need to be acknowledged and replicated.
Absolutely. And I think
Yeah.
this is why having these conversations is so important, because we know from our experience, we know from working with educators and other professionals for years. But if you have a new parent coming forward, right, and that child is at school and that child is experiencing what our children have been experiencing, I think it's so important for us to be there to guide those parents. So I really, this recording, will be, I'm hoping, a gem for them, because they parents, new parents on the journey, really need to understand that they can use their voice, they can advocate for their children and say, well, look, it's a small tweak, small adjustment that you need to make in a classroom setting for
Yeah.
my child. And he doesn't need to, feel like he's being isolated in any way. And that's really important.
Yeah.
So important. And
And I think one thing also I would say for new parents is that I think it's important to think about and plan for these types of supports, if you will. And if you go back, we both shared that. I think both of our sons share the I don't know if it's a dislike or an of asking for help, right? And
mm,
this is a big challenge. And if you think about it, it doesn't sound like much. Oh, that person doesn't like to ask for help. But if you really think about how, not being able to advocate for yourself and to ask for help really throughout the day can cause all kinds
Yeah.
of little misalignments, right, with your environment that build and grow. And I think now I know in the case of my son, he's literally on his IEP since he was like 3 years old, has had ask for help. Okay. And I don't think it was until he was maybe 13 or 14 that we actually started to see it happening organically, fairly regularly in the classroom, right? So if you think about it, 10 years of like focusing on this one skill, right?
Mm.
And I think that sometimes when your child is small, you don't think about those types of skills. You don't think about the
Yeah.
cumulative effect of those kind of deficits and skills. The worry is about school readiness and school
Yeah.
performance and being able to make friends and all of these things. And I'm not saying that's not important, but I'm
Yeah.
saying that, you're raising a human being. And so it's
Yeah.
important for us to really think about them as a human being and to recognize that some of these skills, they will not just come with age. I think there's also the kind of, again, as a parent, this is something new, right? And we're not necessarily prepared um,
Yeah.
when these kids come into our lives, and we have to learn. So, many things did come naturally with age for my daughters, right? But with my son, a lot of those things don't come with age, and things like, asking for help or advocating for yourself. I think with my daughters, a lot of it kind of just started to come naturally, right? As they got better at conversation and they were, just out in the world and modeled what other people did. But for my son, it really took an effort. Um,
Yeah.
and I think, another thing that I really see uh, causes a struggle with my son, and I'd be interested your experience as well, is kind of that theory of mind. It's like really
Yes.
struggling to understand that the other person does not know what you're thinking, that you have to form that thought. You have to give them that information. And in our family, we've had some hysterical, kind of results of that, where my son, just he has in his head, it's very clear, he has in his head, even down to, what do you want for dinner, or which restaurant do you want to go to. And it's very clear that he's waiting for you. This is when he was younger, very clear that he's waiting for you to guess what he wants. And his sisters and I would say, we can't guess, you have to tell us. And he would, storm off angry because we hadn't been able to kind of guess what it was that he was thinking. But that translates in his life, over his lifespan, in many different ways. And that's a tough skill, to
Yeah.
learn. And it's definitely something that I see is a struggle, and contributes to struggles that my son has. And again, I think that's something that, as a new parent, I kind of wish I had understood it better when he was
Yeah.
younger, and maybe been able to, just kind of drip feed some skills or things over his lifetime, um, more and more. So I think, you know, it is important when your child's younger and you're starting this journey to really recognize that you're raising a human being,
Yeah.
um,
Absolutely.
not just an academic outcome, or a social outcome, but a human being that is going to have really complex emotional needs as an adult.
Absolutely.
And are you doing, as a parent, are you, kind of figuring out how to adapt, those types of, skill lessons, or those types of lessons over his lifetime? Are you getting the support from others, and the community? I don't know. I don't have all the answers for it, but I know that is one thing that I kind of wish I had known or been more aware of when he was younger.
Yeah, and I think you've mentioned such important points here, and the biggest one I think for me, it goes back to observing the child. If
Yeah.
we can just keep observing that child, the younger, and if we keep, even make a note of it, right, and see where there's gaps, because like you mentioned, your son's story, the theory of mind. How can we teach that? Because a lot of our children pick up from their environment, right? Social
Mm,
skills, communication skills. They'll pick up through mimicking or just observing. But our neurodivergent children often struggle to. So if we can, as parents, observe them and then fill that gap by teaching them through various models, it could be through visuals, through storytelling, through video modeling, whatever it may be.
yep.
But we can put that into their part of their learning. It doesn't, like you mentioned, have to be all academic, because once they've mastered or managed these skills, the academics will follow. But what happens, we put so much emphasis on the academics and miss these essential skills, that then our children, and it does, I think, Hola, it does lead to mental health, because they're
I
exhausted.
Yeah.
They're mentally exhausted, masking all day at school and
Yep.
asking, like you said, that one goal on his IEP, asking for help.
Yep. And I mean, I'm fortunate. There were people in my son's life and my life that identified that very early. I
Yeah,
mean, I myself, when he was 3 years old, probably wouldn't have said we need to put asking for help on his IEP. But I was fortunate enough to have people there to recognize that this is an incredibly important skill that he probably is not going to get on his own.
yeah,
So I feel very fortunate, but I agree with you. And there's all kinds of ways. And I think even in how you read with your child, right?
yeah,
If you kind of can recognize at a young age that, like, okay, my child is, is struggling with this theory of mind, right? Um, you can even kind of, how you interpret books and videos and how you talk about things, you can kind of, bring those topics up, right? What are they thinking? What do you
yes,
think they're thinking? You stop that story. What do you think they're thinking? And if they're not good at it, you model it, right? Or,
yes,
even in your conversations, instead of getting frustrated and saying, you have to tell me, come up with a creative way to help him understand that you can't read his mind,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Hola, we can talk about this forever, and we can, right? I
Yeah.
want to ask you that one question, and I don't know if you have an answer to this, and I honestly don't. But how can we close the support gap? How can we make it okay?
I I mean, again, I know it's kind of a different set of challenges and resources in every environment and every
Yeah,
family. But I think where I am is, my son has great access to, in terms of insurance coverage, and, he has mental health coverage and he has rehabilitation coverage, and we have all of that. But what we don't have in the community is really enough professionals who can understand how to support my son's mental health issues, right?
mm,
Um, so it really renders any, that resource that I have on paper useless.
yeah,
So in my corner of the world, I think what we need is more people who actually have the understanding and the experience um, working with neurodivergent individuals, people
yeah,
who have recognized that there's a need and a gap, and that, we can't as a therapist, for example, you can't just go sit down across from a neurodivergent individual and say, okay, tell me how you're feeling. How was your day? What was, and expect that they're going to be able to just share that with you. Um, you know, I don't know where these people are, but
Yeah.
we need more of them. So I think the first thing we need to do is to have conversations like this,
Yeah.
um,
Absolutely.
with more people and in more spaces. And I think that where we intersect with educators and decision makers, these conversations need to happen, and we need to subtly put that pressure that this is a need. This need is here. And I think that it's very important, when we're talking about education or government or decision makers in that way, to really showcase that we have this group, not an insignificant number of people, who really, their barrier to independence and making their way in the world healthy and contributing members of society is not their intellect. It's the support that they're getting in the areas that we're talking about, right? And I think this
Yeah.
is really hard for people to grasp. It's
Yeah.
really, really hard. Even for educators to grasp, it's really hard for them to understand where the gaps are for our kids. And so I think it's our duty to talk about that and to work with those professionals who do understand, um, this group and the needs and the gaps, and make more noise about it, and talk
Yeah.
about it more, and highlight the needs, and highlight what, if we just take mental health, if we had, I cannot tell you how many phone calls I get from other parents who are in the same
Yeah.
situation, how many parent WhatsApp groups I see where it says, does anybody know a therapist who can work with a neurodivergent child? Does anybody know it? And we've all been around, and people are willing to pay out of pocket, or they have good insurance. It's not a matter of, access. It's a matter of the fact that the skills are not there. The
Absolutely.
professionals are not there. And I think we need to address that.
We do. We do. There's so much more work to be done. So much more work to be done. And we need to keep, like you said, making that noise. And
Yeah.
Hola, I don't think I can say, goodbye to you today. I feel like we're going to have more conversations, because this is just a start. I have so many more
Yeah.
questions to see Hola, so many more questions. But I am going to bring it to
And
an
I feel
end
like we've
for
touched
now.
on things that need their a
Exactly.
whole discussion on its own, right?
Exactly, exactly. So we are going to wrap up for now. But
Okay.
honestly, Hola, I think we need to talk more, and we do need to make more noise, not just for our children, for all the children, right? And I'm going to end it with saying our neurodivergent children are so talented. They have so much to offer the world, but we need that world to be ready to accept them and just be slightly, right? I'm going to say slightly flexible, in terms of accommodating them, because they can make a huge difference, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think the key is those accommodations can be learned
Yes.
relatively easily.
Yeah,
It's not
absolutely.
something that requires you to go and get a master's degree. It requires you to have kind of an open mind, and learn some new skills. And
Yeah,
that will get you, 90% of the way.
yeah. It takes, and I will say this, it takes patience and empathy. That's it. If you can be
Yep.
empathetic and you can be patient, um, you can really make a difference. We can all make a difference in the environment that we're living in within our own communities. So thank you so
Yeah.
much, Khawla.
Thank
Thank you for
you very
joining us
much.
today. You're welcome. Your time, and your energy, your input, your expertise, it's really, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank
It's
you for starting the conversation. It's so important.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome, and I look forward to having you back on again. Thank you. You
My
take care.
pleasure.
Bye.